Hey everyone, Mari here. I recently had the opportunity to have a conversation with Andy van Ark. Andy graduated from Owen in 2011 and has had a robust career in the consumer packaged goods world. Andy has worked for companies like Mars, Red's All Natural, Catalina Crunch, and Bulletproof 360. In our conversation, Andy shares his international career journey and highlights his experiences in various countries and cultures. He discusses the challenges and rewards of working in global settings, the concept of being a third culture kid, and how these experiences have shaped his leadership style. Andy emphasizes the importance of being intentional in pursuing an international opportunity, adapting to new cultures, and maintaining one identity in professional settings. He also offers great advice for those of you who are interested in international careers. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome, Andy. We're really excited to have you here on our podcast, A Thousand Ways to Leave. Thank you so much for volunteering to share your story. Before we kind of dive into the questions, I just want to get a little bit of background information about your professional experience in a global setting.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be talking to Owen folks and, to all the Owen alum and Owen students out there today as well. So for sure. Yeah. So context for me, for everybody is that I grew up outside the US. So I was born in South Africa and moved around quite a bit. So when I was young, we moved to Germany, to Berlin, Germany, and lived there for 4 years. So through my early teen years, I was in Germany. Learned the language, which obviously helps out internationally, depending on, if you're able to use certain languages, which obviously German is quite specific, but it's, paid off for me in a couple of different international settings. And then when we moved to the US, I was 16. So I moved with my family to California. Lived out in California for 10 years, did my undergrad out there. Worked in San Francisco for a few years before Owen, and then moved out to Nashville to come to Owen. 2009 to 11, I was at Owen, did my MBA in marketing and strategy. So really wanted to go into what I'm doing today. So CPG, consumer packaged goods, marketing, and worked for Mars for about 10 years. And so really good CPG background experience in brand management. For the most part, I went through their graduate leadership development program. So that was 3 years of different rotations, which really kind of whet my appetite when it came to different roles and responsibilities and also functions. I worked in sales alongside marketing in those roles, which was great because I got to experience a lot of different things. And, I'm kind of a naturally inquisitive person. And that's why I love marketing. That's why I love brain challenges, because it keeps me interested in what I do every day, but also the component of international, right? Like I said, I grew up internationally. And so working for a multinational company like Mars was great because I would start to see opportunities to work with other cultures and countries. And so my first couple roles started to see those possibilities, right? So people within our program did some international rotations. A friend of mine went into Australia and worked for Mars Chocolate down in Australia. And so, I started to sort of plot my plan of what does my international rotation or my international role look like at Mars. The benefit of working for a large company like Mars is that, obviously they have presence in a lot of different countries. And so you can really start to look at what do opportunities look like to move into those roles, whether it's working with people in the country or it's actually moving to the country and working within that business unit. So after the 3 years of my leadership development program, I graduated out of that program, went into a regular role. At the time, we had moved quite a bit. We were in California for a little bit, and we went to Chicago for Wrigley. And then came back down to Nashville. So we're in the Nashville area, working for the pet care business here. And since then, my wife and I had 2 kids. So, had a young family at that point in time. And so we had to kind of decide, we're like, hey, this is a good opportunity. Our kids are not in school yet. And so we wanted to make sure that we picked a good time. I would say there's never a perfect time for an international opportunity. It's challenging any way you look at it. Even if you're single, I would probably say that's one of the the best times to go on a personal side. The challenge is you don't have a support system. You don't have a spouse or kids that are there to kind of support you mentally through that process. And so there's pros and cons of those kinds of things. And you just have to consider all of those. The other thing is it's quite hard to get an organization to invest in an international move or rotation if you're early in your career, right? So a lot of companies will look at somebody and say, am I willing to invest in this person? Or is it just a high risk to send them because it's very expensive, very costly to send somebody internationally? And so you have to build credibility within your organization, show that you're investing in them, and then they can invest in you to continue your career with them. So I went through that process around rotation. We looked at both Europe and Australia. There's obviously certain things to consider when you're looking at international rotations. Is with Mars as an example, you needed to assess, was that business unit capable of absorbing what would be kind of a high risk cost, right? So if you're an American and you're going out to another country or another business unit, the US is huge. So we have the benefit of usually having a large P&L, a large amount of overheads that can support people in the organization. If you go to a country like Spain, Spain doesn't have a lot of that, right? Like they have a slim team. They won't have the opportunity to be like, yeah, come on in and we'll absorb a US associate into the company that doesn't know anything about Spain or has very limited knowledge about the country or how the brand or business works within the country. And so you have to be kind of strategic about what country am I going to? If you're working for an organization that's based in another country, obviously that helps a lot, right? So if you're working for a German company and you want to go work in Germany, that's going to be fairly easy. But if you've got a specific location that you're considering, you have to really think about, how do I make that happen in the right way? Or if you're working for a specific organization that you really enjoy working for, you need to be open to where those locations are, right? So those are all very important when you're thinking about international rotations and making the right choice. That's, the right choice for you as somebody in your career, that you're trying to make the right decision, but also for the company, because you're trying to showcase that you can add value for the company by taking that opportunity. So ultimately, we looked at Europe and we looked at Australia, and the business need in Australia was there. And so I had traveled before actually going to Owen. I'd gone to Australia for a few months, and I knew the country. I have some family down there as well. And so, was really excited about that opportunity. So we moved down there with our young kids. Our kids were 1 and 3 at the time. So really young kids.
Super young, yeah.
Which was, obviously quite challenging. Like I said, they weren't in school, but at the same time, anybody who has young kids out there definitely understands the challenges with toddlers. And so we definitely had those, right? It was a very long flight to Australia with a 1-year-old.
Sure.
And so that was tough in itself. And then significant time change differences. The other thing is Australia is quite literally the other side of the world. And so even as you're far away, you're on different time zones from your family and having to adjust and understand that that's the normal, right? I mean, I kind of joked, I'm a big football fan, and we would watch Sunday night football, but on Monday morning before going to work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's such a different mentality and time zone and distance that it definitely turns you upside down. And so you have to be okay with that. And like I said, I grew up internationally, so it's definitely helped a lot with my perspective and my understanding of change and resiliency around that. And so we went through that process with our kids and moved down there. We lived in a very rural town. Mars, as I'm sure other companies, especially production companies and manufacturing companies, their headquarters are not going to be kind of like downtown ritzy cities. A lot of them will be small towns or suburban areas. And so those are obviously things to be aware of, right? Is like if you're going to go work for a company and they're going to expect you to live in a certain location in a foreign country, you got to know where you're going, because if you don't, you can land up in a strange environment that feels even more foreign than if you had to live in a city that at least had modern and convenient things that you're used to in the United States. And so, that's really a important thing as well, is knowing the country, knowing the location, knowing the area you're going to be living in, knowing what support you get to get there from your company as well. Those are all really important considerations as you're planning these kinds of things. And so you have to have this long conversation with your organization to make sure that it's working for you, it's working for your family, but it's working for them too. And so timeline for me, I mean, I basically had to build that structure for about 2 years. So building up towards when we moved, I had already seeded a lot of conversations. We had to wait for the opportunities to come up because they weren't frequently out there. And so you have to be patient, and it's not something that's going to happen in a couple of months or a couple of weeks. You really have to wait around and make sure that the right opportunity comes up, that there's a mutual fit for you and your company. The culture of Australia definitely permeated through Mars, Australia, right? So you could tell you were working in a very different culture than the United States, but it was a really great one, very family friendly, sort of felt very much like everybody working there was family. There was a lot of long tenured associates that worked in that business and continue to work in that business. And so, really enjoyed the time there. As our kids started to get into school, we knew we'd come back. We knew it was going to be more of a shorter term opportunity. It was great though when I was there because Mars was fantastic. They really took care of us and even provided us they offered us to permanently immigrate to Australia at the end of my time there, but we knew we would want to come back and be closer to family as our kids got older. And so, we moved back to Franklin, continued to work on with Mars for a few more years. And then after Mars, left Mars and then landed up working, like you had mentioned, for smaller food and beverage startup companies. So I've, in the past 5 years, been working for a number of those, leading sales and marketing. All those roles have been remote, but had a really great experience in the past few years in a very different environment, obviously more US centric, but still have a lot of interaction with global folks. My current organization is owned by a company out of Guatemala. And so I will say, even if you do not take on an international rotation or an international opportunity, every company today has a multinational component to it. And so you will continue to see the advantages of having had that experience, even if you're just a US based associate and working in US businesses. So a really great experience, and, really glad that we took that opportunity.
Yeah, wow, quite the experience for sure. And it sounds like even though now you're working for a company, based in the United States, being out of Guatemala, you're really able to use your international experience in kind of what you're doing today. When I talked to you last, there was a term that you mentioned that I had never heard of before, and I looked it up and I found it to be really interesting, the third culture kid. And just, I'm not sure if everyone has heard that term before, but can you kind of explain the third culture kid and how it resonates with you?
Essentially, what a third culture kid is somebody who grows up in a culture that is not their parents' culture. And the reason that's important is because parents play the role typically of being able to translate the world for their kids, right? And be able to kind of say like, well, this is what the cultural norms are. But if the parents don't understand what the cultural norms are, or they're trying to figure it out, the kid is also trying to figure it out at the same time. And so it leads to a lot of capabilities that kids build pretty quickly. And as a parent myself, my wife and I see this all the time with our kids, and kids are smart. They figure things out really quickly. And so when I was growing up, basically I had to figure it out, right? We lived in Germany. I didn't speak the language, right? So we moved there. I hadn't taken a class of German in my life until we literally moved there. But within about 6 months, I had figured out like conversational German. I was able to have conversations with people. And in the few years that we were there, I came back with a really strong ability to speak the language. And then obviously I recognize, I think this is an important thing, is I realize I'm not a German, right? I wasn't becoming a German. And I also think that's an important thing for people to think about. And this is important with third culture kids, is maintaining your own sense of identity. And it's challenging, because if you move around quite a bit, you can lose that, right? You can think, well, what am I? Am I an American? Am I South African or German? And so with third culture kids, there's that confusion that happens in their own head where they don't understand where they belong. Now, that's a con of the third culture kid, is the lack of sense of understanding or belonging. But the pros that exist is that there's a lot of resiliency.
For
Right.
sure.
So the ability to work through and weather change is something that I continue to see people like myself who've also been through those. I have a lot of friends who obviously have lived in a lot of countries. I went to an international school, so I'm still in contact with a lot of those friends of mine from Germany. and they exhibit those same kind of capabilities. They can go to a different culture and navigate the challenges of different cultures very easily. And it even goes beyond that, right? It's not just about culture, it's about change in general, right? So in organizations, work in small food companies, change is constant. We don't know what's going to happen a week or a couple months from now. And so just being able to be okay with change is something that comes out of this third culture kid mentality. And so raising a child in a different environment, in a different culture, that child has to adapt to that environment. Their parents can help guide them. And obviously my parents did to their best ability, but they still are limited in the understanding of the culture that they're in. And so you've got a large group of people as, the world has become more multicultural and there's a lot of business movement. You have a lot of kids that are growing up as third culture kids because their parents have moved to different countries that are not their own. They're being raised in those environments with, limited guidance on what that culture is like. And so they're having to figure it out themselves, and they're building resiliency through that. And so that's a little bit about third culture. And again, I didn't understand my challenges I was having even up into my adult professional life of like, why am I like this? And then a big light bulb came on when I read the book about the third culture kid, and there's a couple of videos online you can find about it. And I'm like, yeah, that's me. That's 100% is I didn't know it. I worked internationally. I had worked across lots of different countries, and there's traits that come out of those experiences that support really good multicultural business work ethic. And so it's paid off for sure in my career and helped me a lot through a lot of my changes.
Yeah, that must have been a big aha moment when you heard that, term and you're like, wow, I really resonate with this.
Yes.
Sounds like
Yeah.
you've done a lot of self-reflection too on that. Just out of curiosity, is there, out of all kind of the countries that you've lived in, is there a certain culture that you feel like defines you most, or do you think it's just kind of a mix of all the different cultures that you've lived in?
Yeah, it's a question I've gotten quite a bit. Most people will ask like which one I like the most. Very hard to answer that question. What I tell people, I mean, my wife's from Memphis, Tennessee, and she grew up in the US, obviously. So, like I look at myself as an American. I've lived here since 1999, so a very long time. I am an American, but I am South African from a heritage and roots standpoint. I still have a lot of direct ties to the country, family there. And like the way I kind of put it is like my heart is there because my fond childhood memories are there. And so it's
Yeah.
very hard to kind of disconnect from those things. But I still am pretty pragmatic where I realize it's not the same place that I grew up in, right? It's not, those memories are essentially just a child's memories. And so I will always hold and harbor that in my heart, right? It's like that's part of the DNA of who I am, but I'm definitely an American and have looked at myself that way for a long period of time. And as far as my time in other countries like Germany and Australia, I definitely felt like a visitor in both those countries. And so in varying capacities, it was positive where there are a lot of people that I met along my journey in those countries that were extremely welcoming and the vast majority of people were incredibly nice. Germans get a bad rap sometimes for being rather harsh, and they can be, I think, but I've met a tremendous amount of people, both on the personal front and then the professional front, that had been incredibly welcoming to my family and myself. And so, but I just really looked at those experiences in those countries as I am there as a visitor. I'm there playing a role, as whether I was a kid in Germany or as an adult, as a professional in Australia. And so I knew that I was just a visitor.
For sure. Yeah, it's good to make that distinction for sure. Yeah. I want to dig a little bit deeper into your international role that you had at Mars. And I think you brought up a really good point that you have to be really intentional if you want to do an international role. It's not like you just come to work and within the first even year, 6 months, they're like, hey, you want to go live in whatever country? Sounds like, that took a lot of different kind of navigating and conversations. And so my first question I wanted to ask you, was that something that you kind of always had on your radar? Was that a goal of yours to do an international role for a large international company like Mars?
Yeah, for sure. It was always on my radar, having lived internationally. When I was at Owen, that was something I definitely was thinking about constantly. When I started with Mars, I understood that Mars had a global footprint, a really big global footprint. I mean, I grew up with Mars products in Australia, in South Africa as a kid, right? So I was aware that they had the capability. But as I started to familiarize myself with the company and the organization and their true global footprint, I had to start to say and figure out, okay, what's the path, right? What does it look like? And it took years to get there, right? Like I said, you had to be patient, you had to show intent, you had to be aware of your intents as not to be forceful, right? Because that's the other thing is you want your leadership, you want your management to be supportive of you, but you also realize that it's not their number one priority, right? It is early in your career, you're not a benefit to most uh, uh, countries that are taking you in. Later in your career, interestingly, it's actually quite a lot easier to do an international rotation or an international move because at that point you've established a capability or a strength that you're able to bring to a country that otherwise potentially wouldn't be able to support you, right? But I was fairly early in my career at Mars, and so I had to kind of establish, hey, this is why I would help a country like Australia. And so I had really had to build that case, right? I mean, remember putting together a lot of write-ups as far as why it made sense. It helped that I had the international background. So, if you are somebody that's looking for a role within an organization, I would recommend, having done kind of study abroad and really showcase that you're open to different cultures because there's a big risk that they could say, yeah, I want to send you. But when you get to that country, you're like, whoa, this is like really tough, right?
Yeah.
This is challenging for me or for my family. I wasn't expecting because you will get a lot of things that you were not expecting, right? So different cultures, especially if you've never lived internationally, I think my wife has a long list of things in Australia that were so different from the United States that you just have no idea until you really go live in that environment. And so those are things you have to be aware of. But when you're creating that case, you want to build the confidence around, hey, I'm really in this for sure. I'm in it 110%. You have to hit the ground running, when you get out there into the country and show that you're overly dedicated to the role, even versus the people that are already in that market, right? So you have to show that value and show the value pretty quickly. But building the case takes time. Get your advocates in the organization to help support you. So I had really great managers who supported me through that process. And you have to get multiple advocates, right? And then reaching out proactively to those countries. I spoke to, I can't even count so many different senior leaders in Mars in Europe and Australia to get them aware of me, to know who I was and, kind of showcase my capabilities to them. And the nice part about an organization like Mars is that everybody was really open. It's a very flat organization. So, you could email the general manager of Italy and be like, hey, I'd love to chat if you've got a half hour. Now they're obviously very busy people, but I think even the intent there of showing that and being respectful, but showing that you're very interested in a international role, those are things that you have to take. It's almost a second job, right? It was something that I couldn't deprioritize what I was doing within the organization. You want to make sure that you're still showing a tremendous amount of value in what you're doing on your daily job, but you have to create a whole separate approach. I mean, it's like applying for a different job,
Oh,
obviously.
yeah. Yeah.
It's tough. And then you've got different time zones that you're talking to people. As I said, I would be pretty intentional about understanding, what's possible, like where can you go within your organization? Have people done it before, right? Because it usually, like I mentioned, there was somebody in my program who she went to Australia, and so it was this precedent of having a U.S. associate in the Australian business. Now, she went to a different business. I went to the pet care business. She went to the chocolate business, which were separate. But still, there was a precedent there. So, there was a little bit more comfort around that, right? There were a number of associates who had gone over to Europe from the US at the time as well, in varying kind of levels. But there were people that had done that. And so you want to kind of cling on to that precedent and be part of that process if there's not a formal process, because some organizations have already built formal processes. They're based out of Europe. A lot of times they will bring in and incorporate US associates into those roles and into the headquarters. Obviously, like Nestle is an example, right? They're a European company. Unilever is a European company. They do have opportunities in those countries because that's where their headquarters are, and they have that operating expense that they can absorb you into their P&L versus you being a hindrance to their business. And so, yeah, so went through that, got the advocates, which takes time, created the business case. It's like, again, applying for a second job, really networked a lot with different people. And, to this point where even today in contact with folks that I even reached out that haven't worked with them, but created a good connection with over the years there. And then ultimately it came to that opportunity, and they flew me out to Australia to come see if that's the right approach. And everything went incredibly well. And so to the point where, like I said, they wanted me to stay, but that wasn't the plan, the initial plan. And I landed up coming back to the US. And so, it takes time. You have to be persistent. I would say if you're really interested in this, don't give up. And you can look outside of your organization. The challenge, again, is if you start to look outside of the organization that you're in, if you want an international role, a lot of companies obviously don't know who you are. And so they're not going to invest behind moving somebody out there. If it is a role that's based in another country, then your move is on you, right? You are the one that has to take care of that. The nice part about it is if you're moving internationally with a company like a Mars or any other large organization, they support you a lot, which is great. They'll fly you out there, they'll fly your goods out there, and it takes a couple of months to get your stuff across an ocean. If you want to do it another way, you can, but it's going to be on you financially to move out there, which these are huge expenses. If you want to move any of your goods, it's a huge expense. You won't get any kind of temporary housing, which can be really challenging. You'll get housing support, so you'll get a real estate agent to help find a rental, or if you decided to purchase. So there's a lot of things that are positives with moving with a big company that if you did it by yourself, it's a lot more challenging. So it's possible, but I wouldn't recommend it because the amount of stress that would be put on somebody that's not done something like that before, and then having to show up day one at a job that can be quite stressful and time consuming, can be quite hard for you.
Oh yeah, totally night and day, I would say. But it sounds like you were super intentional about it. And it took, years of kind of networking and making that case, which is incredibly impressive. So you talked about some surprises. I want to hear, once you got to Australia, what were some of those kind of cultural shocks that you went through, whether it be professionally as well, like working with colleagues that had different cultural backgrounds or different norms, and how did you navigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, there's a lot. So first off, there's the cultural side, right?
Yeah.
Which is quite challenging. And coming into a culture that's new to you. And I will say Australia, a lot of people might be thinking, hey, Australia is not that different from the United States. And to some degree, you're right. I mean, everybody speaks English. That's obviously a big plus. I've lived in a country where that's not the case, right? So like you land in a country and nobody speaks the language that you are very familiar with. Big challenge, right? So
Yeah.
one of the biggest considerations I would say for anybody that wants to go international is, do you speak the language, or can you get by? Or are you going to learn the language? So that means countries like Australia, UK, like you can move there pretty easily, but you're still going to have a lot of the cultural concerns or adaptations that you're going to have to be aware of. So in Australia, some of the things that really stood out pretty quickly was that it's a very different society from the standpoint of a lot of people are very joking, even in sort of formal settings. There's a lot of joking. Everybody has a nickname in Australia.
Oh, interesting.
So it's just the thing people do. They all have nicknames. And I also was working in rural Australia, right? So very different from, like I mentioned, like big cities. We did have an office in downtown Melbourne, which I frequented. A couple of people on my team were in there, which is night and day from the big city to the rural town in Australia. So very, very big difference. So you had to be aware of that, right? So you'd walk into this work environment where there's a lot more kind of joking going on. And, that fits my personality. I enjoy that. It kind of makes it pretty laid back and so on. And you can build rapport with your team pretty well that way. But the biggest thing when you're moving to a culture that's different is, as I said, it's the small things that you're not aware of, right? So in Australia, for example, especially rural Australia, shops and stores shut down frequently, right? So they may be open for maybe 3 to 4 hours. A lot of restaurants are not open in our town that we lived Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So it might sound like something quite small, but when you're like, hey, I need to go get groceries and the grocery store's closed,
Yeah.
those things matter, right? We had young kids, like I mentioned. And so going to the store, understanding how things work when you're there, what you can buy, what you can't buy, the kinds of foods that are accessible there versus what you're used to in the United States. Small things, but on a daily basis, those are challenges for people. Food tastes different. The cost of food is different. Cost of everyday expenses is very different. Navigating challenges when it comes to healthcare and insurance and all those kind of everyday things that you need to work through can be very, very challenging. Like I'll give you an example. When we moved to Australia, we were not afforded the same benefits as Australian citizens, right? So we were not allowed on the healthcare system. There's a private system and there's a public system. So Australia, has public healthcare and good healthcare. We really had good experiences. Our son loved to run into things a lot when he was young. So we spent quite a bit of time at the doctor, but we were not allowed on the public healthcare system because we were, sort of temporary. We were on a visa. And so we had to go through the private system, which was great. But those are challenges that we had to kind of navigate when we got there. Most of Australia, you could walk into a doctor in Australia and get support as an Australian citizen, but we were not afforded that same kind of support. We had to go through a different system. And so, buying a car, selling a car, how that worked, there's no resale market in Australia for cars. You had to do it through private sellers. There's no Carvana or whatever that is, right? So those were very challenging, right, in your everyday to day life. And so I'm trying to do this really stressful, hard job. My wife's got the 2 kids at home and they're little kids, and we're trying to figure out how to do all these things. And so, the little things in life become very hard. And so that's one of the challenges when you go to another country. It's just navigating through those things. And like I said, this is Australia. I mean, I have a friend actually from Owen, Michael Chow. He moved to China, right,
Oh,
with
wow.
Walmart. And so he's another guy that we actually his wife and my wife connected because we were both expats at the same time. And China's like a whole nother deal, right? When you talk about differences in culture and what's there or not there versus the United States. And so those are the things that you don't necessarily think about, or it sounds exciting and exotic, right? When you first think about it, you're like, oh, that would be really cool. But when you do it every day and you're like, okay, I can't go to the grocery store because it's closed and it's only open a few hours every day, that becomes a hindrance and a nuisance. And so those are quite big challenges, and you have to navigate through different systems and processes. Generally, though, I think Australia, as far as most things, was fairly easygoing from my experience, right? So like Germany was my parents navigated through a lot of really crazy laws and stuff in Germany as a country. And Australia is a lot easier than that. And South Africa has a lot of other big challenges, whether that's crime or safety as well to kind of navigate through, which I grew up in and realized. So every country is going to have those significant pros and cons. You just have to make sure you're aware of those things. Every country will have its cultural nuances that you have to adapt to. And so, but there's a lot of pros too, that come from it. And so we really enjoyed a lot of the things. We got to see a lot of places that were just phenomenal, right? Sydney and Melbourne and cities are just amazing places to go and be a part of. There's an amazing coffee culture in Melbourne that we saw, and we traveled throughout Australia with our kids. Beautiful beaches, like I said, amazing people, very friendly people. And so we got to experience a lot of things that obviously we wouldn't have been able to. And so you just have to be open for it, right? You really have to roll with the punches and make sure that you can't get knocked down, right? So if you run into a wall and you don't know how to access, we had been in Australia for 2 weeks, and my son ran into the corner of a wall and bust his head open, and it was blood everywhere. And he's a crying 1-year-old. And we're like, what do we do? Right. And so we drove him to the ER at 10 o'clock at night, and sat there, and they glued him back up again, and everything was fine. But that was kind of a challenge that we'd just landed in the country and didn't know how to navigate those things until we had to really do it. So that's again cultural side and personal side. On the business side, again, I mean, people were a lot more, I guess, low key from what I was used to in the US. I will say I've worked with a lot of cultures in my career, right? So aside from just Australia at Mars, I worked with a lot of folks out of Europe. We'd work with a lot of folks out of Asia as well. And I think one of the things I've learned in my life about that's helped me in my professional sense is two things. It's really patience, right? So like different cultures take things very, very differently. And you as somebody who's not aware of the culture has to be very patient, right? So we worked a lot out of with the teams out of Thailand when I worked at Mars, incredibly different culture. And so, but it's just about patience and making sure you're following up and they are supporting you as needed and, great culture to work with. But I think coming from an upbringing from South Africa and Germany has taught me patience. You can't be forceful with people. You can't come in and take over the conversation. And I think US folks a lot of times get a bad rap for that, right? Like we're pushers a lot of times, especially in business, where we're coming in and we're drivers, because that's a lot of the culture that we have in the US is about driving and pushing success forward and pushing organizations and projects forward. But when you're operating with other countries, you just have to be a lot more patient, direct, but patient about, what's gonna happen and making sure you're getting things done. The other thing I will say about professional moves and going to different cultures is don't lose who you are, right? So don't lose your identity. And the reason I'm saying that is because I have seen people, and I mean, I've got a mixed identity from where I've come from and so on. But like when I went to Australia, I was known as the American, and that's okay. That's great. Like everybody in the office knew who I was because after I came, one other American came into the company, but the whole office, a huge office, hundreds of people, and I was the only American there, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's okay. Like, I think some people can kind of be like, no, I want to like be like everybody else in the company or in the culture that I'm working in. But like, no, you still have to maintain your identity, right? Like that's who I am. That's where I'm from. I'm okay to be recognized like that. I will do my best to show up and present well to that business as an American, right? I want to be proud of being an American in this company and in this culture. But again, you have to be patient with all the things that are new and so on. But don't lose that identity because that's really what you are and who you are. And so you're not there to conform entirely to that culture. You have to be respectful and you have to learn and you want to learn about what those cultures are about. But like you still are who you are, right?
Yeah.
And so I think maintaining that is super important. And if anything, I think in my experience, that's why I've seen a lot of people in other companies and cultures be hesitant to hire and bring on Americans is because they haven't had a lot of international experience, right? Like I mentioned before, building international experience is important if you really want to do something like this. But you want to make sure that you're presenting a great vision of like what an American associate really could be to another country, right? The value that we would bring to them, right? We're generally the biggest marketplace for a lot of businesses. That was the case for pet care. The US is huge compared to the rest of the world. So I brought this understanding of a marketplace that others in countries like Australia don't have. But you got to be humble. You got to be humble, right? You got to bring that, the experience and the understanding, but be humble about how you present yourself and show up and be patient with your learning because it's going to take a little bit of time to get up to speed on how things work. Don't assume or that you know things. You have to adapt to that. The Australian consumer, just for context, I mean, I worked in pet care in the US, worked with a lot of global pet care associates during my time prior to the Australian role. And when I went to Australia, I was like, man, I'm sure I know this pet care consumer in Australia. I'm like, no, it's entirely different,
Oh,
right?
wow.
So yeah, that's something else it's not just that the organization's different. The consumer is different, right? And in my area within marketing specifically, but also, within consumer packaged goods, we're selling food and pet food in this instance. The consumer is incredibly different. And so you can't come into a country and assume that you know what's right. You have to make sure you're understanding the consumer and what they are, what their needs are and the trends within that marketplace. And so that's again the patience, the humility, learning those things, learning from others in the company, but also be willing to challenge a little bit where it makes sense, right? I mean, if there's processes and capabilities that you're like, hey, this could work so much better, just have that conversation. And I think that's where the values start to come in. That's where you start to show like, hey, I can really contribute to this company. And, that's what I did in Australia and really enjoyed doing in Australia and made a lot of great connections through that as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that. I think those are great pieces of advice, especially just being true to who you are. I think, when you're in a whole new culture with, a lot of different people than you've interacted with before, you can kind of lose sight of that. But just remembering, why you're there, who you are, I think that's awesome advice. So one other thing I want to ask you, Andy, because of course the Thousand Ways to Lead podcast is all about leadership and your leadership style. And you've had quite unique experience working for iconic brands, but also, in different cultures and countries. So how has being from South Africa, living in Germany, United States, then working in Australia, now coming back to United States and working for smaller CPG brands, how has that kind of defined your leadership style today?
Yeah, tremendously. I mean, it's been a big impact on how I lead today. When I think about the experiences I had globally, and then also just again, my upbringing, I referenced it a little bit before, but the patience, humility component's important because I don't know everything. And the more I work, the more I understand that I really don't know everything, but I do have experience, right? So I do understand, and I've seen things and had those things play out in my career and in the categories and areas that I've worked that I think can inform really good decision making, right? So that's obviously where I think I add a lot of value from a leadership standpoint. I managed folks in the Australian business, and again, very culturally different from what I was used to being a manager in the US. And so I learned a lot about them, but about myself and how I want to be as a manager and a leader. The one thing I learned that really impacted me from my experience in Australia is when you go to a foreign country and you want to build trust, the best way to do that is to really be able to get in there with the teams, right? This is a big component of who I am and what I believe in as a leader is that you want your team to understand that you're willing to be in the trenches with them, right? And when you're taking an international role, that's really the only way that you're going to build trust is to show that you're getting into the trenches with them, because that's really how you build a connection with people is to get in there, and you're not directing them, you are supporting them. You're within brand management specifically, I had done a lot of the things that my team was doing in Australia while I was in the US, but when I was there, I was like, okay, let's do this together, right? Let's look at the data. Let's understand what this opportunity looks like. Let's build this business together. And that's something that I still am very conscious of in my leadership now in the US, is that the one thing I love about working in startup environments is that, it's not that I can do that, it's I also have to do it. Right. So I have to work with my teams, with my brand teams, with my sales account managers, and go to retail customer meetings, present to them, go through data sets and understand performance with my brand team. And so those are things that I realized in my role in Australia that, a lot of times I think when you're at Owen and you're thinking about leadership, you're like, oh yeah, you can kind of sit in the ivory tower and direct people. And it's great because, now it's really just about like strategy and people management. And that is a big part of it. Leadership is about defining the direction, setting that course, and making sure the people in your organization are following through and really on board with it. I mean, it's a huge part, especially as you keep growing in your career. But you also need to manage the component of like building trust with your team. And a big part of it for me, and I think this is where a lot of leaders miss, is that they don't understand that the teams want to, or most people want to understand that you've been there, you've done that. They know that you are speaking from experience and you're not just speaking from a position of authority. And so, in Australia, we launched a new brand there. We launched a lot of new innovation. And so that's working closely with R&D. So I had to get very heavily involved there. We leveraged the US R&D team to help support the Australian team. So my old team here helped support them. with new technology. And so I was like on the ground level, working hard with the team, building those relationships. And it not only helps you with your team and leadership within your team, but it helps you on your executive leadership team level as well, right? Is like if you're in marketing and your supply VPs or COOs are seeing like, hey, he's really in there, he's bought in, he or she's bought in, then that's also going to really support building that trust across the organizations, across functions. And so that's what I saw worked really, really well, and I continue to do today. And what I love about working in smaller organizations now is that most of my job today is supporting my team. It's getting in there with my team and focusing on how do we get better? How do we get those wins that we need and building those things together and not just, setting a strategy and then stepping back and having others do it for you. And so, that is also a personal decision, right? It depends on what career direction you're going in, what you want out of your job, right? I think that's going to be important. Your kind of organization, in manufacturing, we make things. So like, guess what? You're going to have to get your hands dirty when it comes to making products and understanding how to make the best products. And so that's what I love about the areas that I've worked in my career and the career I've built is that I say to people all the time, what I do, I put there out in the world, right? Whether it's advertising, whether it's innovation, products, packaging, it's fairly tangible. And so, I have to support my team in doing that and making sure that it's looking as best as it possibly can and appeals to the consumer in the right way. And so the international experience has really helped me see the value of that.
For sure. You've kind of seen every facet of the company, and I think from an employee perspective, that just builds credibility and trust for you. So yeah, that's a great perspective. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Andy. My last question I was going to ask of any advice you have for professionals, Owen students or prospective, MBA students who are looking to build international careers. I think you gave a lot of advice. I don't know if you have any kind of closing piece of advice that you weren't able to share. But for me personally, I didn't mention this, but I have a lot of interest in an international career someday and have had some international experience so far. And so there's a lot of takeaways that I had. And I think specifically just being so intentional and how networking is such a big aspect of landing that international role. I guess I'd never really talked to anyone about it, but sometimes maybe my perspective was, they just ask you and you say yes or no, but that's not really the case. Maybe in some organizations it is, but I don't think that's necessarily the reality. And then just navigating once you get there, both, from a cultural difference perspective and then professionally, some of those differences and being patient and not losing who you are. So lots of different takeaways. I don't know if you have any last closing piece of advice, but for me, it's been a really beneficial and interesting call with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun to just kind of, I don't get to talk about this kind of stuff that often. So it's good to kind of, be able to talk and hopefully provide value, whether it's to current or Owen students or already alumni who are looking at international roles. And I think that just a final point for current Owen students or prospective Owen students, when you think about international, and if you've already got, like yourself, Mario, if you've already got a plan or an idea around, I want to do something international, right? The beauty of Owen is it's already a multicultural environment, right? So like, I'm sure everybody that's in school understands and sees how many connections they can make with different cultures and different people. So build those connections, make sure that you have those folks. Because even today, if I went to Japan, I know that I would be able to connect with Owen alumni from Japan. And so those are very, very valuable, and those connections you can make. And so my advice is continue to get those experiences, whether it's a study abroad or even trips that you're able to see and connect with different organizations. If you're earlier in your career, you have the opportunity to kind of map out. You're like, hey, I know I want to be in Europe, or I want to have a time when I'm going to be over there. So guess what? Like, look at the companies who are there, start making those connections. If there is a connection through Owen, look a person up online and be like, okay, hey, that's an Owen grad. I can reach out and talk to them. Like generally us Owen grads, we're always open to having conversations if there are people that are interested in what we've done, or if we've got connections that can help people. So you could start early. You don't have to wait until you're in the company and you've got a job. I know it's stressful when you don't know what you're going to be doing, but at the same time, you can start, even if it's like, hey, this might not be the job that I get out of Owen, but I know there's these companies and I can build my way towards those companies and get to a point where I've got that international opportunity. You have to really be thinking about it long term if this is a real true passion of yours. And building that plan to kind of make it come true. And honestly, it will. Like, I think everybody that a lot of the Owen grads that I've stayed in contact with, and my Mars friends who have also done international rotations, they've just been intentional, right? It's just about be intentional, build those connections, create that case. You've got to make your own case to like, hey, nobody's going to give this to you. You got to make that case as to why you deserve to have an opportunity. And then from there, it'll come. You just have to be patient. You have to put that out there, work hard, do the best you possibly can and create those good connections. And then from there, the one thing I'll tell you just to leave you with is I think it's a little bit of a snowball effect, I will say as well, with international. We chose to come back to the US and reestablish our roots here for family reasons. But once you start in international, it just keeps snowballing where, I've got friends who they did one international rotation and then they went to Europe and then they went to Africa and then they went to Australia. You can pursue that. And I will say it's not for everybody, right? Like once you start having a family, it's hard because, when you get further along in your career, it's actually sometimes easier to get an international role, but you've got kids, you got to move your kids, they're in school or they're in high school. And and there's a lot of people that have done that and understand how challenging that can be. But once you start actually building that international experience, recruiters will start looking for that because you've been there, what it's like. And so they're more open to hiring somebody into a company or a role that has experience in transition and understands different cultures and have worked in those different environments. And so if that's, again, what you want, that's a good way to think about it is once it starts, you can really snowball into a career that's international. But buckle up. You got to get ready for a pretty crazy ride because international comes with a lot of its own challenges as you go to different countries and organizations.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like you've navigated them really well and to be determined if you'll do an international role, I suppose.
Yeah, we still talk about it. I mean, our kids are pretty comfortable. You guys, obviously, everybody knows Tennessee is a great place to raise kids. And so we're really comfortable with where we're at right now. But the one thing I'll say about the third world child, you will always have an itch to move. Right.
Yeah.
So if you lived internationally and you grew up internationally, there's something I actually have a friend of mine from Franklin down here. They just moved to South Africa, actually. So to Cape Town with their 3 kids. And so that's the third culture thing is once you've done it, there's an itch to always move because you're constantly curious about culture. And so that is something that's very hard to get away from. You can scratch it a little bit with international travel, but unless you actually make again another international move. And like you said, to be determined for me, really happy with where we're at right now, but it could be something that we're open for in the future.
Definitely. Well, awesome, Andy. We really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I know everyone, all the listeners will get just as much out of it as I got out of it. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.